بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. So we're continuing on with our discussion of purification. Last time we had spoken about tayammum, basically closing up the chapter that encompasses both men and women. So up until now we've studied wudu, we've studied ghusl, and we studied tayammum. Today we're going to spend time talking about menstruation and postpartum bleeding. Why does this need a separate chapter? Or does it not?
Women specific.
All right, this is women specific, right? This is something that only happens to women, and not just that. There are a lot of specific issues that revolve around this specific situation. So this chapter is completely dedicated to these two things. We'll talk about the relationship between them at the end, because usually most of the fuqaha, they start with menstruation, which is hayd in Arabic, and then they usually close the chapter with postpartum bleeding. And again, we'll talk about the relationship and why that is, inshallah. So when a woman is in her menstrual cycle, she is not allowed to do these 10 things in the madhab. So she can't, the act of praying and the obligation of praying. What is the difference between these two versus fasting?
Versus fasting?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, maybe they could still be similar. Act of praying, I'm assuming when it's not obligatory, you don't necessarily have to.
So when we talk about praying and fasting, we're talking about the obligatory praying and the obligatory fasting. Okay. We're talking about the faridah here.
Okay. What's the difference?
Yeah, so over here he splits up praying into two, right? The action and the obligation, but here he just says fasting. So if you actually go to Al-Umdah, I'm sorry, he breaks these into two. So there's 10 total. He breaks the praying into two, and then he does fasting by itself.
Maybe because praying has like a specific form.
Mashi.
Breaking up.
Amna, what do you think?
The difference between.
Wait, what did you say?
I'm asking you. Like, why is it like this?
So he splits up prayer.
He splits up prayer versus fasting. Or Syra. I mean, you guys know. Like, you should know better than me.
Why is prayer split and not fasting?
Yes. So when a woman is in her cycle and she comes out of it, she has to make up what?
Her fast.
She has to make up her fasts, but she doesn't have to make up her prayers. Like, why do you guys think that is?
Because it's more difficult to have to make up all the prayers.
Right, because the actual number of prayers is just so many, right? A woman, according to the madhab, her cycle can go as long as 15 days, right? So you're talking about, what was that, 65 prayers that she would have to make up in that time period, which is, it's just not, or it's even more than that, 75,
Yeah.
right? It would be 75 prayers that she has to make up, and it's just too much, right? It's overwhelming in the sheer number, even though time-wise it might, like 75 prayers sounds like a lot, but you know, within a few hours, I'd imagine, or within 2 to 3 hours, she'd be able to make them up. But this is why he splits them up, right? This is why he splits them up, meaning that she can't, not only can she not pray, she cannot pray. It's not just that she doesn't pray, she cannot pray, and she doesn't have to make that up. The actual obligation, it falls away, right? It falls away. So if I did fasting and I wanted to set it up in the same type of format, would I say the act of fasting or the obligation of fasting?
The act of fasting.
The act?
She's obligated to still make it up.
So the obligation would fall. The obligation wouldn't fall.
Yeah.
Right? The obligation falls for the prayer, but the obligation does not fall for the fast. All right. Also, she would not be able to allowed to make tawaf. Tayyib. This brings up a very interesting scenario, especially nowadays, where people cannot extend their trips. So the final tawaf, or tawaf al-ifada, this is where you basically close out your hajj and you leave. And if a woman is on her cycle, what does she do?
Doesn't she have to pay?
It's not enough to expiate. You actually have to perform it. It's one of the pillars of the Hajj.
Oh. She has to wait.
Right, so she has to wait, right? This is number one. Or this is kind of like a middle thing. She would make tawaf and expiate. Ibn Taymiyyah, he actually says that she would make tawaf. She has to make sure that she's clean, make sure that, she's not, what's a good way to express this? She's not dropping any blood, right? Making sure that the area is, protected. And as long as those conditions are in place, she can make tawaf. She can make tawaf with those conditions. And wallahu alam, there are a number of ways to do it. Or, according to, in the madhab, she can make tawaf and she has to pay a kafara, if there's a time restriction. She cannot recite Quran. Now the recitation is what qualifies as recitation.
Where you can understand it.
Where you can actually understand what she's saying, meaning that she can actually recite under her breath, or she can recite very softly so that others can't hear. And this is the opinion of the Hanafis, the Shafis, and the Hanbalis. Don't make the letters discernible. The Malikis and Ibn Taymiyyah, they say it's permissible. She can recite normally. There is no restriction on that. And these are the three reasons that they use. They say, number one, that the hadith that this ruling is based off is weak. They said, secondly, that the analogy, even if you use the hadith, the analogy doesn't apply. Because the hadith says that if a person is either junub or ha'id, meaning that if a person is in a state of sexual impurity, or if a person is menstruating, they cannot recite Quran, or I think it's just the junub, I'm sorry. So if a person is in a state of janaba, he cannot or she cannot recite the Quran. So they say the analogy doesn't apply. Why?
Because it's not a state of sexual impurity.
Okay, and what else?
Because when you're junub, you can quickly come out.
And janaba is a choice, right? Janaba, many times it's a choice. And even if it's out of a wet dream, what do? It's very easy to come out of that state. Can you come out of the state of hayd? Can you come out of your cycle when you choose to? No, you can't. There's no choice. This is something that's natural. And lastly, because it's a difficulty, like it's an unnecessary difficulty. A woman who wants to review Quran, or a woman wants to do all these things, it's just something that's not possible. It's not something that's reasonable. The sixth, touching the mushaf. Touching the mushaf. So the Hanafis and the Shafis, they say that she cannot touch it at all. The Malikis and the Hanbalis, they say she can touch it with a barrier, and the Lahiris, they say it's okay, not a problem, not an issue.
What do you mean, like with a barrier?
With the barrier, gloves.
For the Shafis, you can't at all, even with like that?
No, even with the barrier, yeah.
What if you take a cloth?
Yeah.
It's not attached.
Right here.
Really?
I thought okay. If it's not on.
I could be wrong. I mean, I'm not Shafi'i, so.
Yeah.
Because, I thought Shafis, they can't put a cloth or something.
All right, let's we can go back on this inshallah and look into it. Is somebody in the comments? Is somebody in the Facebook? See if anybody commented. Staying in the masjid, there is a general agreement amongst all the madahib that she cannot stay in the masjid, but in general you can. You can pass through. Mizzi, who is one of the, no, this should be Muzani, not Mizzi. Muzani, he said that it is actually permissible. He was a Shafi'i student, one of his most famous students, and there's a minority Hanbali opinion that also says that it is permissible for a woman to make itikaf and stay in the masjid. Obviously, this is by ijma', right? This is by agreement that intercourse is impermissible during a woman's cycle. You cannot divorce. You cannot divorce while a woman is on her cycle. And when we get to the issues of marriage and divorce, inshallah, we'll talk more about that. Unless she requires it, this is like she can request the divorce during her cycle, but the divorce will not be acted on until the cycle is completed. Counting the waiting period, using the calendar. Basically what this means is that while a woman is on her while her menstruation cycles continue, she cannot say that she cannot use the calendar months to determine when her iddah is over. She has to use her cycles. She has to use, as long as her cycles are continuing, meaning that she is obligated to use those cycles to determine when her waiting period after divorce is over. Okay? Any questions on this last one, or is it clear? Okay. So when a woman is, when she comes out of her cycle, when she finishes her cycle, she is required to make ghusl. And the only other time that it plays any importance is the beginning of her accountability. Is that, yani, she is treated as an Islamic legal adult. There is a floor age for the Hanbalis, meaning that if a girl has her cycle before she reaches the age of 9, she would still not be considered a woman. Meaning that she would not have the Islamic, she would not, Islamically, she wouldn't be legally treated as a woman if she was before the age of 9. Saying that, I don't know, if you guys have heard of like what is the youngest mother? Have you guys looked into this, or you have any idea behind it? It's actually 5. So it's like 5, 6 years old, the world's youngest mothers. A lot of those cases, unfortunately, a lot of them are because they're like highly radiated areas. So there's like a lot of radiation in those places. So I think the girls, they matured quicker, and many of them are incest. Like, so, you know, it'll be like the uncle or whatever, you know, he actually did that. It's not because they married. It was an unfortunate situation on top of an unfortunate situation. The later Hanbalis, they say 10 is the floor age. So between 9 and 10, but the vast majority of them say it's 9. For the Hanafis, they say 7. You guys know why this is? Why the floor age is 9?
Because Aisha?
Because of Aisha. Because of Aisha radiallahu anha. So, other than ghusl, so if once a woman finishes her cycle and she takes ghusl, everything goes back to normal, right? But these are the only things that don't require ghusl. Does that make sense? Meaning that if it's pre-Fajr, like 5 minutes before Fajr, she's for sure, her cycle has ended, she can now fast. She doesn't need to wait until she makes ghusl in order to fast, right? But if her cycle ends, for example, after Ishraq, her cycle ends after Ishraq, does she have to pray Fajr? No, she doesn't, right? Or if she ends before Fajr comes in, her cycle ends, and the time for Fajr starts, can she pray? She has to make, not just she can, she has to make ghusl and pray. All right? So fasting becomes obligated regardless of whether she has ghusl or not. And divorce, like the man does not have to wait until she takes ghusl in order to divorce her. It just needs to be established that her cycle has ended. Any questions on these?
Isn't it even for intercourse, like when a woman, like,
No,
she's clean?
that's lazim. Like, so basically, it is still impermissible to be intimate with her until she takes ghusl. Like these are the only 2 exceptional cases. Even though her cycle is complete. So if a woman's cycle is complete, she has to take ghusl before she's intimate with her spouse. Right? She can't be intimate before she takes ghusl. Why is that?
Because it's nasty.
Okay, fair enough. No, and obviously, you know, there's a spiritual association that's associated with ghusl also, right? It's not the lifting of the state. The lifting of the state is a spiritual experience. It's not, you know, it's not, there is a physical tie that's close to that. But for example, if a woman takes a shower, and because, you know, it's okay to take a shower while you're on your cycle, a woman takes a shower, she cleans up, and then like a few hours later or a day later, she determines that her cycle is finished, completed. She still has to take a shower again, right? She still has to take a shower again once it's completed. The first shower does not count as a way to finish off her ghusl. How long can a cycle go? Or how long can a cycle be? It's khilaf, right? There's a difference of opinion concerning it. The shortest that it can be is 1 day and 1 night. Meaning that if a woman's cycle, she determined 8 hours, like her bleeding started, 8 hours later, 10 hours later, her bleeding finished, and she's for sure she's clear, can she make ghusl and start praying according to this statement, according to this opinion? No, she can't. She has to wait 1 entire day, 1 entire night. And from the moment that she started, she cannot be pure. She cannot be pure until one day, one full cycle, one day and night. I keep, all right, I'm using the word cycle, right? The cycle just keeps going, coming back and forth. But she has to complete one day and one night, and then she can be considered, because that is considered the minimum in the madhab. So even if she stops, right? At any point during the day or night, if she stops, she still has to complete the day and the night. The later Hanbalis, they said that a few drops can be ignored, right? So sometimes women spot, something that's very natural. They said that those 1 or 2 drops can be ignored because that is not actually considered her menstrual cycle. So after she completes, and this is in the madhab, this is in the madhab, after her cycle, she feels her cycle is complete, what she would do, she would wait a period of time. It's not an hour, right? It's not like 60 minutes, an hour, because obviously they didn't have clocks, to determine all this. But she waits a period of time that is reasonable, hour, 2 hours, whatever. And then if she's like, okay, for sure, I'm clean, she would consider herself clean at that point. She would take a shower, and she would continue about her day. And we'll talk about what happens if it comes back, right? If she spots again, or her cycle returns, or she has bleeding again, what is that, and how do we deal with it? The Hanafis, they say the minimum is 3 days. The minimum is 3 days, regardless. And the Malikis, they say whatever time period is required. So even if it's a drop, it's considered her cycle, and at that time she would be clean once she considers it to have stopped.
So when they say 3 days, is it 3 days, 3 nights, or just 3 days?
Yeah, 3 days, 3 nights. That's in entirety of 3 days. The longest duration. So that was the shortest. The longest duration, again, difference of opinion. In the madhab, it's 15 days. In the madhab, it's 15 days. So if the longest is 15 days, this also means that the minimum clean time, this is important to keep in mind too. The minimum time that she is off her cycle is what?
15 days.
It's also 15 days. Meaning that a woman cannot be on her cycle again for another 15 days. Regardless of what happens. And again, we'll talk about exceptional cases.
Wait, okay. How does that work? Because there are women that have it seemingly for the month.
And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that, because a lot of that goes into the determination of, okay, what is the minimum? Because if there's a minimum, there has to be some type of gap, right? And there has to be a minimum time, because a woman cannot just perpetually be on her cycle, right? Otherwise, she's never going to pray, and she's never going to fast, and it's not, you know what I mean? And that's just not a realistic situation. It doesn't happen. And are there situations that happen like that similarly, similar during the time of the Prophet ﷺ? Yes. And those situations are called istihada, and we'll get to it. So the minimum and maximum age, we had spoken about the minimum age of when a woman can start her cycle. The minimum is 9, and this is in the madhab. This is in the madhab. The minimum age is 9, the maximum age is 60. What does this mean? So regardless of what happens before 9, her accountability has not started yet. So because there's no takalif, there's nothing that she can be held accountable for, and there's no reason for you to even take those into account when it comes to prayer and fasting, because essentially she does not have to pray or fast. Meaning that if she wanted to pray and she wanted to fast, and she has her cycle before the age of 9, what? She still can, because it's not technically considered that. What does this mean? After the age of 60,
She still has to pray.
she is not going to be considered part of her cycle. It's not going to be considered menstrual blood. It's not going to be considered menstrual bleeding. I think they did a study, like the oldest woman to have her cycle. Do you guys know that one? It was like 67. 67. Yeah. But I mean, and obviously you have miraculous cases. It's just like Ibrahim, like Sarah, like Ibrahim's wife. So, whatever. The Malikis, they say 70 is the max. The early Hanafis, the Shafi'is, the Lahiris, they said, and that should be a plus, not an equals. Yeah, it's like, right? They all equal Ibn Taymiyyah, right? They say that there's no ceiling. Basically, it is what it is. As long as her cycle continues, you would continue treating it like that. But after 67, we don't have any record of it going beyond that. So here in this situation, sorry if it's a bit crude that I use the red dots. So based on what we took previously, right? We said 10 was the maximum in in the Hanafis, and the 15 is the maximum in the madhab. What would happen in this scenario? So this is day 1. Sorry, I tried making these lines as reasonable as possible. It's bad? All right, so here it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? This is day 5. And this is day 12, and this is day 13.
So according to the Hanbalis, that would be...
This is one cycle.
Yeah, that would
right?
be constant.
Jayid, okay.
But for Ahnaf, after 10 days, those other couple of days, she has to pray.
She would have to pray these days. Right, and if a woman can pray during these days, she can also do everything else, and she can be intimate with her spouse. There's nothing wrong with that. These would be considered istihala. They would be considered like a bleeding from a vein. It would not be considered period blood. So from 10 day onward, from here onward, this would be considered istihala. This would not actually be considered period blood. And the majority would say that this is the end of her cycle. Yani after this day, then her cycle has been completed, and this is the cycle that she develops. Because there are 2 types of people in the madhab. There are 2 types of women, people, right? There are 2 types of women in the madhab. There's a girl who just started her cycle, who just started her period. So to establish her cycle, there's a different way to deal with that. And then there's a woman who has a regular cycle, right? So if a woman who has a regular cycle, and again, inshallah, we'll talk about that. Is there any questions on this? So these are some unique situations and unique scenarios. A woman who just started her cycle, you would not actually count her days until the 3rd cycle. She actually has to go through 3 cycles in order for us to determine what is her cycle. How many days is it? So a woman with an established cycle, anything that extends beyond her established cycle. So for example, if her cycle is 5 days, if for example her cycle is 7 days, her cycle is 3 days, once that becomes established, that becomes her norm. Okay? That becomes her norm. Meaning that if anything goes beyond that, how do we treat it?
Like istihala.
We treat it like istihala.
But what if let's just say you have like established amount of days for like 5 months.
Yes.
And then a 6 month, it changes a little bit.
You reassess. You reassess. Because what's going to happen is that that scenario can be considered one-off, which is possible. Or what if that extends for another 2-3 months? The first time you would treat it like what? You would go on your previous cycle. The second and third time, it starts happening, you would reestablish your cycle.
So then that becomes your new cycle.
That becomes your new cycle. Because cycles change, right? Like, obviously people grow, people change, there are hormonal imbalances and changes. So those things will always adjust and they'll always change. So the other thing that's important in the madhab also is discernment. So discernment is basically how you treat the blood. And what used to happen even during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, when the women were unclear, they would have special garments that they used. They would have special garments that they use. Basically like how tampons and sanitary napkins are used today. They would have those special garments that they would use just for their time that they're on their cycles, and they would go to Aisha and they would ask her to help them discern what type of blood it is. Just to help them figure out, like, just to get an idea, like, okay, is this period blood or is it not? Or is it just a regular bleeding? And Aisha radiallahu anha, she actually used to help them. And she used to tell them, like, okay, these are certain signs you need to look for, right? If you see certain colors, if it's darker, etc. So in general, the darker, more odorous blood, that is menstrual blood, that's period blood. And sometimes it's very difficult to tell the difference, right? It's not like, okay, and you have to realize it's men who wrote this book. So it's all just like, it's like a third party type of thing, like, hey, this is how it looks. But if you actually talk to women, it's not always this clear, right? It's not always this clear. You can't always tell if it's actually period blood or if it's just a regular bleeding. So you do the best you can. Do the best you can, and obviously every woman knows themselves and they have a better idea of how that is and how it's supposed to be. If it is indiscernible, right? If it is indiscernible, you're in your 5th day, you're into your 6th day, and you cannot tell, then you establish your cycle at 7 days. You establish your cycle at 7 days. Then so by the way, this is like an introductory Hanbali book.
So if you have like a established thing of like 7 days, isn't it like no matter how your blood looks like that is your period?
That becomes your established cycle. But what if, so again, we're talking about changes, right? When would you use this situation? when there's a change in your cycle, right? So when there's a change in the cycle, at that point, all right, I need to figure out, I need some markers to help me determine what my new cycle is. I've gotten to a point where I can't figure it out. So what do? I would just set the maximum at 7 days from the time that it started, and then going forward, I would reassess. Pregnancy. If a woman bleeds during her pregnancy, if she spots during her pregnancy, again, something that is very normal, something that is very natural, according to the Hanafis and the Hanbalis, it is disregarded. You don't need to worry about it. It's not a big deal. According to the Malikis and the Shafi'i, it is treated as a period. It is treated as a period, and a woman, obviously if she's in her period, she doesn't have to pray. One of the nice things about the Hanbalis is they have a concession for women who are about to deliver. So once the labor pains start, you do not have to pray.
So for Malikis and Shafi'i, because I haven't actually studied this yet.
Yeah.
Regarded as a period, meaning do they have to make up?
They have to make up the fasts, not the prayers.
Like they have to pay, or they literally have to fast that whole month of Ramadan again?
No, I mean, it depends on the situation. So the thing is, when we get to fasting, and we talk about fasting, that issue will be discussed very specifically. Because you have, with the Hanbali, the madhab says that a woman who is pregnant or is feeding, she is excused in the moment that she has the ability. She has to make it up before Ramadan comes again. Right? And if she waits, then she has to still make it up, but now she's going to pay a kafara for every day that she missed. Right? That's in the madhab. But inshallah, like I said, we'll get to it. So, any questions on this? Like, I don't know why this is like an introductory book, but this is so complicated. So there are some things, again, that just to share. Istihala is a unique situation. Right? It's a unique situation, meaning that if a woman continues past her cycle, it is treated as istihala, but before every salah, she still needs to make wudu. She still needs to make wudu. A cycle can be reassessed, like we said. So, a woman might be established on a particular cycle for 6 months to a year, to 2 years, to 5 years, but that can always change, and every woman can reassess that cycle at that point. Fasting is made up, while the prayer is not something that we had mentioned in the beginning. Postpartum bleeding. When is this considered?
As soon as she gives birth.
So, in the madhab, no. Any bleeding that is caused by childbirth doesn't have to be after the birth. So in the madhab, as long as it's because of childbirth, meaning if a woman bleeds while she's carrying, that is considered postpartum bleeding. It's considered nifas. It's not considered hayd.
Can you say that again?
Sure. For the Malikis and the Shafi'is, anything that happens before childbirth is hayd. Anything that happens after childbirth is nifas. For Hanbalis, anything that happens due to childbirth, meaning that she can still be carrying, that would be considered nifas, it would not be considered hayd.
So then her nifas period starts.
Yes, it would start, which is why you have this, I'm sorry, where am I? Which is why you have this concession. Like, how do you determine if she's, ready to deliver? Women are usually a pretty good gauge of that. But I would say when her labor pains they come to a point where like she just can't focus on her prayer anymore, at that point she's excused from praying. The maximum is 40 days. So this is postpartum bleeding. The maximum for it is 40 days. The Shafi'is and some of the Hanbalis, they say that it can go up to 60 days. And the minimum, there is no minimum. There's no floor. I mean, as soon as she stops bleeding, she can go back to her life. There's no floor for postpartum bleeding. And what do? You treat it as an extended menstrual cycle. That's all it is. As long as a woman is bleeding, she would continue treating it as if she is on hayd. Any questions on this? Oh, that went a lot faster than I thought it would. Are there any, I guess this brings us to the questions, things that are, I guess, tangentially related on the rulings on I guess tampons, sanitary napkins, right? Pads. All of these are permissible. There's no scholar that says and using any of these is impermissible.
Even a tampon.
Even a tampon. There's nothing wrong with that. All of these are meant to help a woman take care of the bleeding. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how did he describe the menstrual cycle of a woman in the Quran? He calls it adha. Adha is it's like an inconvenience. It's like an inconvenience. It's like a, I don't want to